What was winemaking like back back in those days? Everything was very rudimentary. Things were very different than they are today. I think with the advent of this trade that I was talking about, where wood was coming from the Americas, the barrel is developed. And the barrel is really such an important sort of innovation because it allows for wine to be made inside of a vessel. And then that vessel, because of the nature of it, can be actually wheeled, and it can be used not only as a transportation element, but it can also be used as an element for maintaining and controlling fermentation of products. That's where American wood becomes a really important part of the landscape of sherry. In fact, the initial term that some people may know is called a sack. Sack refers to the Spanish word saca. And so when you would buy your wine, you would buy a sack, which would be a drawing of saca, mean drawing from the barrel. So you would receive your barrel, you'd be like 3 sacas would be, 3 sacks would be 3 barrels. So essentially that's where the term sack comes from. So this is where we are, very rudimentary right now. Stuff is just being fermented, there's no control. So you've got these vineyards, they're all outside of the cities, and you've got these casas de la viñas. That's where fermentation is actually happening. So the grapes are coming in. They're normally being dried out a little bit in the sun to concentrate, so you get a higher alcohol level, which becomes part of the tradition of sherry. And then the wines are crushed by men who are wearing these kinds of shoes that have nails basically sticking out of their soles. And these nails allow them to really crush the grapes. And then they're filling the barrels, and you can just imagine there's just spontaneous fermentation going on. And what happens? Well, the barrels are just exploding, the bungs are opening up, and they learn very quickly, like, maybe we shouldn't fill the barrels all the way up because we got to leave room for the wine to expand and ferment. So back then in the 18th and 19th century, winemaking styles are divided into 2 categories of wines. One is called natural wines, and the other one is export wines. So natural wines are the wines that are basically the free run juice, right? The first pressing. These were the best juice that was around, and these were wines that were called palmas. The next layer of wines are called rayas. And then really almost the third category of wine, the least interesting, these are within the Olorosos, kind of oxidative, is what's called the Policortados. The Policortados back then were defined as rough wines. After that, of course, you've got the must, and back in the olden days, and today we use everything. So the must was either further dried to make a concentrate and boil it down to make something called arrope, which was a coloring agent, or it would go into distillation. This is really in Jerez. In Sanlúcar, the general trend was probably less sophisticated, because you got to remember, Jerez is a more sophisticated area. In Sanlúcar, they were basically making this lighter style of wine. And this lighter style of wine was really due to the fact that they were in a cooler area where they made a wine that had to be fortified for export, but they made a fresher, sort of livelier style of wine. Eventually, this style of wine would be copied by the Jerezanos once it becomes really popularized. In Jerez, we have the second classification wines. These were the export wines. These export wines were classified by the color. And if you look at the chart, the wines were classified from golden to dark, right? With dark being the most expensive styles of wines. Dark wines were obviously oxidative, more powerful, more alcoholic. More than likely, they were fortified through the addition of alcohol and or arrope, which is boiled must, because alcohol added stability for shipping, and also if you added arrope, you added color and darkness. Again, Sanlúcar were likely fortified because for transportation, these delicate wines needed that. And this is really important when we start talking a little bit about the discovery of flor and where fortification plays a role. So, winemaking styles in the 20th century. Number one, you have to understand flor. And you have to understand an incredible fact that up until 1934, nobody knew what flor was, okay? The Sanluqueños, I think, had this sense like, look, this stuff is growing on the wine and it's kind of cool and it's not making it taste bad, it's actually making it taste better. And if we add more alcohol to it, it seems to get really aggressive. But in 1934, it's actually identified as a beneficial organism. And so all of a sudden people are like, oh my God, flor needs to be part of our story. So it becomes a protector for oxidation, and it becomes something that really dramatically changes the wine. And in fact, it's adopted by the Jerezanos, who start copying this lighter style from Sanlúcar, start changing the classifications and start making wines that are, in my opinion, copies of Sanlúcar. And Sanlúcar is an area that defines a more modern vision of vinification. Now that yeast is discovered, and people start realizing the importance of yeast, there's an interest in really trying to utilize yeast. They realize that yeast is a great protector, it protects against oxidation, and it also has all these benefits for the wine. And because of that, the styles are completely changed, and there's a rethinking of the classification, and it's the classification we have today. So at the top of the chart, you've got the Finos and Manzanillas, which are biologically aged. These are unoxidized wines. Manzanilla obviously being from Sanlúcar, and Finos are everything else from Jerez, El Puerto, and things like that. The next category, you've got Amontillados. Amontillados being those wines that have spent time under floor in a biologically aged component, and then by addition of extra grape spirits, actually creates an oxidative kind of personality. These are the most prized styles of most wineries. Then you've got Olorosos, which are fully oxidative wines. And then what's very strange is Palo Cortado becomes kind of the sought after sort of unicorn, because a Palo Cortado is a wine that behaves like a Fino, Manzanilla, Amontillado, and then changes characteristics and becomes also an Oloroso at the same time. And it becomes this really kind of unique wine that each bodega identifies with. At this point, there's classifications, there's rules, the Consejo starts coming into being and starts organizing. There's an organization, a stratification for export markets where you have three separate tiers of the industry. You have the exporters, which are the top of the food chain. So these are really the nobility. They're the ones who are basically in charge of doing all the export and all the merchandising. Second to that, you've got the almacenistas. Now, almacenista comes from the word almacén, which is warehouse. They're in charge of warehousing and actually aging the wines. They sometimes get very powerful. And in fact, the Jerezanos used to have all these almacenistas sitting in El Puerto, but their stocks were so important that eventually they realized that they had to control the almacenistas, and so what they did is they set up their own warehouses down in El Puerto, and that's why El Puerto has a lot of famous wineries that are exporting companies that were down there, like the Osbornes, the Lustaus of the world. So you've got the almacenistas, and then at the third tier, at the lowest tier, is the growers, because the growers are the farmers, it's the blue collar. This stratification creates an efficiency in the system, but it also creates a downward pressure because prices have just been pushed down, private labels being made everywhere. And today it is one of the lasting vestiges which will need to change, and we'll address that in further part of this discussion.